says 6 o'clock, so I'm going to start the proceedings formally and welcome everybody. My name is Luke Whitington. I'm the Executive Officer of the Search Foundation, who's hosting this event. Before we begin, please be aware that this meeting is being recorded, so we can post it later, probably tomorrow, to the Search Foundation YouTube channel. I'll post a link to that in the chat section so you can check out other videos and bookmark it so you can see the video up tomorrow. Indeed, I'll post a few things in the chat section. I'll post the abstract for the article, which Troy and Ben will be talking about mostly tonight on basic income, and the link to the article as well. So don't worry if you miss a reference while I'm speaking. I'd like to begin by acknowledging, as we always do, that we're meeting here in Australia on Aboriginal and Torres Strait land. Sovereignty of this land was never ceded. This land was taken without consent, without treaty, and without compensation. I pay my respects to elders and leaders, past, present, and emerging, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, traditional owners, and First Nations all across the continent. I'm on Gundungurra and Darug land, where we say, Warami Gamarada, welcome, comrades. We're very lucky to have Ben Spies-Butcher and Troy Henderson with us tonight. But before we get to that, first I'll tell everyone about the event and then give a 30-second intro to Search, and then a quick introduction to Ben and Troy, and then Ben and Troy will speak for around 25 minutes. They might do it a little bit together, bounce off each other a little bit. I think Ben will kick us off by talking a bit longer about what this article and these proposals included are about, and then Troy will come in and discuss it as well. After that, we'll have questions, which I invite you to submit in writing in the chat section to me directly. We will wrap up on the hour, when you can hang up or stay on the line for a few minutes to listen to a song, during which time you can post messages to everyone, including Ben and Troy, in the chat section. To enable us to run this efficiently, all participants will be muted unless called upon to ask a question. After you've asked your question, please mute yourself again. When you submit your question, please let me know if you're happy to ask your question yourself or if you'd like me to ask it on your behalf. The chat section is limited to me as the host, so messages directly to me as the host. Otherwise, we won't be able to collate all the questions coming through. But at the end of the meeting, you will be able to message everyone, including Ben and Troy, and post any links or make any points you'd like to make in the chat there. So a quick introduction to Search for those who don't know us. Search is a membership-based democratic socialist organisation that links and enables socialist activists across political parties, generations and movements all around Australia. We have members from diverse backgrounds and interests, but we have common aims and values, summarised in our goal of democratic ecological socialism. We run socialist education programs, we publish news and views on Facebook and at search.org.au, and we put on events like this one. This is our last event for the year, so thanks everyone for turning up. I encourage you to like the Search Facebook page to keep up with our events. We'll be holding many more next year, including a continuation of our Red Film Festival film screenings. And go to search.org.au if you're interested in applying for membership, or simply to get in touch with me to talk about what Search does. Our contact details are on the website and on our Facebook page. Now to introduce Ben Spies-Butcher and Troy Henderson. Ben Spies-Butcher teaches economy and society and is head of the sociology department at Macquarie University. He completed his PhD in economics at the University of Sydney while working in the non-government sector on issues of human rights. His research focuses on the political economy of social policy and the welfare state, particularly how economic and political change shapes social policy financing. His current research explores how financial logics common in the private sector are reshaping social policy through changes in public sector budgeting, and the potential for these changes to open new opportunities for egalitarian social provision. In addition to his academic publications, Ben is a regular contributor to The Conversation and is a social policy whisperer for Power to Persuade. Ben is a research associate at the Retirement Policy Research Centre at the University of Auckland, a member of the Policy Advisory Group for COTA New South Wales, and was the 2017 Glenda Powell National Travelling Fellow for the Australian Association of Gerontology. I'll do a quick introduction to Troy, and then I'll hand it over to Ben. Troy is a political economist Troy Henderson, with a particular interest in basic income studies, economic and social policy reform, and the political economy of work. He's recently completed his PhD thesis on basic income as a policy option for Australia, and has extensive teaching experience across the political economy curriculum. Between 2017 and 2019, he's worked as the research economist at the Centre for Future Work at the Australia Institute, and he's published widely on basic income and labour market issues, presented at numerous Australian and international conferences, and appeared regularly in the media. Many members will also remember Troy from his time working at Search. So I will now hand over to Ben first, and I will post the abstract of the article which we'll be discussing tonight in the chat section. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Luke. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Wonderful. Look, thanks so much for having us here, and for the last thing, thank you so much for everyone for turning up. I know everyone's gradually moving into holiday mode. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm also here on unceded Aboriginal land. I'm on Eora land in Sydney. And what we're planning to do is I'm going to give a bit of an overview of what we were trying to do in our paper, what we found, and some of the implications we think come from that. Then I'm going to hand over to Troy, who's going to talk a little bit more broadly about basic income, and we're going to try and make sure there's lots of times for questions, including, and I think it's good to say up front, including questions and comments from people who might be sceptical of basic income as a strategy for a kind of egalitarian transformation. So what we did with this, and we started this project before COVID hit, and it is really quite remarkable how much change has changed in the last 9 months or so. So when we started this, we were modelling what it would look like to move Australia's very meagre and pretty stingy conditional welfare system into one that looked more like a basic income. We did that by taking New Start, which is now Job Seeker, without the COVID supplement, and also modelling what that would look like with an extra $75 a week, which was the ask that was being made by ACOS at the time that we were designing the model. And so we also want to acknowledge that even then we didn't think that was particularly adequate, but we thought that was a good way of testing out some of these ideas. And we wanted to respond, I think, to 3 big concerns. So one was that basic income was just unaffordable. So, and maybe stepping back a bit, I imagine most people here do know what basic income is about, but we're talking about an unconditional payment to everybody, usually to every adult at least, maybe a smaller one for children. We're looking at one for all of the working age population, and it's partly because the age pension acts a little bit like a form of guaranteed minimum income or kind of a basic income for people over retirement age. So we were looking at modelling that. So the first concern is this is just so expensive, it's completely unfeasible. I think it's useful to note that how much even the higher payment we're going to be talking about today is, the cost of that is well below the current annual budget deficit that has emerged this year. So as I say, the fiscal rules of politics have transformed completely. The second was a concern, I think, amongst parts of the Australian left, that we already have a very targeted welfare state, very targeted payments. And so a basic income, the main result of a basic income would be to give more money to rich people. That we already give money to low-income people or people without a job. So this will only create less egalitarian conditions. And the final one was that there's no really credible pathway for policy making. That even though people have been talking about this basic income idea for ages, in fact, if you talk to Troy, centuries, we really haven't got off the ground in terms of getting any country to really fully embrace one. And that suggests there's some bigger political obstacle. So that were the 3 things we were trying to do. And started at the first one. What we decided to do was to say, well, let's look at how the payment system's already structured. Let's look at payments that are a little bit less stingy, less conditional than New Start, and let's see how we could try and make the whole system look less stingy. And we're particularly interested with the age pension and with family payments. People know both those payments, they're still means tested, but they're just nowhere near as stingy or conditional. There's not the same level of stigma. We don't have constant attempts by conservatives to demonise people, to force them through enormous hoops at Centrelink to pry into every aspect of their lives in the same way that is the case with New Start. And so when we looked at those payments, one of the interesting things is, so they've got a universal base rate, and they are partly means tested, but they still go to most people in the category. So most people over retirement age get at least some of the age pension, and that's going to be the case for the foreseeable future. Even with the maturation of superannuation, most people will still get at least some age pension. And most families that have children receive family benefits. And so drawing on some ideas in the kind of social policy literature, we went, well, does it really matter if you're going to have a basic income and you earn a little bit more money in the market and you pay tax on that income, so you pay income tax? Is there any real difference between paying 20 cents in income tax or losing 20 cents of your benefit? And we said effectively those two things are logically identical. They have the same impact on the budget. They have the same impact on your finances, on distribution, on incentives to work. They're basically the same thing. So we said, well, if we're going to have a basic income, we should just make New Start so that it reduces at a slow enough rate that the combined effect of losing your benefit and paying tax is progressive. That is, people who have lower incomes always keep more of every dollar than people on high incomes. Yep, that's the model. That's you can read all of the detail in the paper, but that's all you really need to know. All we were doing is combining these two things together. So what this system does is in effect three things. It does that to means testing, so that means testing is just integrated into the income tax system, and and everyone can access the basic payment pretty much. It gets rid of all forms of conditionality. So if you know that New Start, you not only have quite onerous requirements now to look for jobs that often don't exist, but you also, we now have before Parliament legislation that might mean that you can't spend your money in any way that you want, that there's a whole bunch of other surveillance at work for the dole and all those sorts of things. So we get rid of all of that. And the final thing, which I think we don't always think about with this, is it individualizes payments. And that means that what you get is not related to what your parents earn, and it's not related to what your partner earns. And that's partly important also because it means that the government doesn't have a reason to find out who your partner is or to make an assessment of whether the person that you're living with is, for the purposes of Centrelink, a partner. And we know from both Australia and overseas that those rules are really punitively enforced. And enforced in ways which really do pry into people's private lives a lot and make it really unmanageable to be able to live your life. So it gets rid of all those things. And so we said, well, what are the effects of that? And we looked at two big effects. There's one on the budget bottom line and one on the distribution of income. And what we found was that if this was fully paid by taxes, and I'm sure there's some people here who would go, you don't need to pay for taxes, there's other ways of paying for it. But both for the audience we were trying to reach and the way the model that we're using works, we needed to finance it from taxation. We said if you did that, this would add to even the biggest model, the $75 extra model, would add to taxes so that Australia went from being a pretty low tax country by the standards of rich countries, the OECD, go from a low tax country to an average tax country. Still well below the taxation rates of countries like France and Germany and Scandinavia, well below those levels, around the middle of the OECD. And then we said, what impact does it have on inequality? And we assumed that taxes would be proportionally raised, not progressively raised. That means that the extra taxes would be in proportion to people's income. So strictly, everyone puts in an extra 10%. Then if we did it like that, it would lower inequality to the levels of Scandinavia. So it would be quite radically egalitarian. And we thought that was quite an interesting finding, that this is both affordable in terms of international comparisons. We're not saying it would happen overnight, but this is entirely realistic in the medium term for policy. It would take us to where other rich countries already are, and it would radically lower inequality. And reflecting on some of the reasons why that might be the case. So our means testing system, while it does target things to very poor people, we've got the most targeted system in the rich world, means it takes money off people who are actually often still very low income earners. it can create extremely strong disincentives to work. You know, the federal government says it wants to cut taxes for rich people so that they have good incentives to work. Well, at the moment, once you've even done a little bit of work, taking an extra shift when you're on Newstart means you lose 60 to 80 cents in the dollar. It also is because we now know that the people who live together who are cancelling each other's eligibility are often both in low-income households. So you've got one person who might not be eligible for Newstart because they've got a partner who's in a minimum wage job, or just above it, and that's interfering with their payment. And we know there's a whole bunch of people who are just kicked out of the system because they don't meet some of the eligibility requirements. So we think that's an interesting starting point for having the debate, which I hope we're going to have tonight, which is, well, we can do this. Is it something we want to do? It's certainly likely to have egalitarian effects, but I know there are a number of concerns that people are raising, and maybe Troy wants to speak to some of those that have been around the union movement in particular over the last couple of decades. But I think it's useful to know that this is a realistic thing that can happen. And I think particularly post-COVID, that part of it already did happen briefly during COVID, where we had this brief moment where we got rid of a lot of the worst bits of punitive conditionality, and we made the payments a little bit more adequate. And we're currently in the process of reintroducing those things. That is, having effectively radically reduced poverty during COVID, we are now very deliberately reintroducing poverty. That's what the government is currently doing through its changes. So I think there is a moment to be able to talk about what we can do, that this is realistic and how we might do that. Our policy pathway effectively is just to reduce conditionality to individualise payments, and then to reduce means testing to open this up to more people. And I think that's something we could even get a relatively centrist Labor Party to say, well, if we're going to do anything with the income tax and welfare system, it shouldn't be tax cuts. It should be loosening the means tests and allowing low-income people to keep more of their payments, and ensuring that more middle-income people are included in a more universal system. I might wrap it up there, hand over to Troy, and hopefully we can get a discussion started.
Brilliant. Okay. There you go, Troy.
Cheers, Ben. I want to kick off just by acknowledging that I'm a very happy temporary guest on the land of the Noongar people over here in Perth today. And having spent an hour walking around Matilda Bay, I've probably got sunstroke, so apologies if I pass out halfway through. Ben gave an excellent wrap of the sort of the aims and outcomes of our paper, and there's really nothing else to add to that. You know, he's a gun. What can I say? I also wanted to say, Luke, sorry about losing Latrell at the same time. I would also like to thank Ben Phillips, who was our third. He was our other co-author from ANU who did all the modelling. And I'm not going to say very much. I'm going to leave most of the time for questions in a forum like this. We've got a reasonable number of people and a reasonably short amount of time. But the point of doing something like microsimulations, the static microsimulation of Australia's tax and transfer system, and modelling the static effect of a change in policy, is that you get it's still going to be an outcome that it is wrong, that is ultimately wrong if the policy were to be introduced. But it's going to be wrong by less than, what a lot of people do is sort of back of the envelope calculation of saying, well, 20,000 times 20 million is 400 billion. Ergo, basic income is unaffordable. This design, having access to this tool, enables us to think through the design of the policy in far greater detail and look at the trade-offs and benefits between, say, having a higher base rate or more universal coverage versus having this, we think of it as an in-between style structure between a pure negative income tax and what other people would see as a properly universal UBI. And when we came to that decision for various reasons. Finally, I'll say, our base rate, even in our second model, at $350 a week, we recognise it's inadequate, right? But we also realise the points that Ben was making about individualising the payments, no more stuffing around at centrally, that these are real material as well as social and cultural benefits to people as well, even if the base rate is too low and needs to be increased a bit over time. And the cost, 126 billion. ScoMo just nicely proved for us that you can fund 200 billion worth of social programs in about 2 weeks, if you want to, by deficit financing. And I totally support ScoMo and Frido in their actions there. But we've got a lot of different financing options. As Ben said, because of the way the model worked, we did it just through personal income tax, which is not at all how we would advocate financing such a scheme. I'm talking particularly probably Ben and I in particular, Ben Spies-Butcher. And there are a whole lot of different types of tax you could raise, plus using a bit of deficit financing to finance this type of program, I'd say pretty easily over a 10-year period. The last thing I will say before I do actually shut up is that to date, the only grassroots campaign ever for basic income to achieve some scale is the failed Swiss referendum in 2016. Up until then, over the last 230 years, they've been overwhelmingly elite-dominated proposals, ideas, campaigns. And all of you would know, with your own experience and the way you've been taught to practice and think about politics and strategy, that most of the time that's useless. You need some sort of social force alongside a good idea if you're going to go anywhere. So thanks a lot, and happy to answer any of your questions.
That's brilliant. Thank you both, and thank you for affording everyone so much time. I think it is, we've had other forums where we've gone quite deep into the hour before we've got to questions, and I really appreciate that both of you before and now, of course, have said that you want to open up. So we've got lots of time for questions, and I'm just by straight precedence. The first question was from Mario Halloran. She said, what do Ben and Troy think about capital grant from the sovereign at age 18 or 25 years? Also, will the right use a basic income to monetise public education and health through a voucher system?
I have things to say about that, Ben. Should I go?
Yeah, you want to kick off and then I can go after.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Marie, and also thanks a lot for all the incredible work that you've done over such a long period of time. A stakeholder grant is easier to afford. I think politically it's more difficult because you're looking at, say, a cohort that's just a single year age group, which might be 300,000 people at age 18 or 25, and that's not a very powerful political constituency. And there are other critiques of the stakeholder grant that, not everyone's, some people are going to basically stuff it up. You'll get 100,000 or 150,000 or 200,000, and for a bunch of people, they'll squander it. The libertarian argument is, well, that doesn't matter, that teaches you a life lesson. But others say, look, the income security you get from a regular fortnightly payment trumps the sort of freedom and wealth equalisation effect of having the stakeholder grant for that cohort. And then the other good point that's all, this is brought up all the time, will a basic income be a Friedman-esque voucher system that is then used by the right to, privatise public health care and education? Well, probably if they could get away with it. It would be that's what Friedman openly advocated. It was the thing that annoys me sometimes with the left critiques of basic income is first the idea that You know, the right-wing libertarians who advocated, they weren't secretive about their aims of shrinking the welfare state. You know, they're pretty, it's all written out. But for the vast bulk of, if you wanted a progressive basic income or a left-wing basic income, only those movements can win that. The idea that this sort of fantasy that the rich are going to suddenly en masse support even a modest basic income like our own, and decide that they will pay for that through the progressive taxation system, and cough up an extra $125 billion a year. I think it's going to be won by the overwhelming majority of people demanding it, not by a couple of Silicon Valley billionaires or right-wing libertarian economists who want to get rid of the welfare state.
To Ben? Sorry, sometimes Zoom.
Sorry, yes. I mean, I'll stop muting myself in between.
Yeah, might as well. You're very Zoom disciplined.
Yeah, so I actually think the stakeholder grant has a bigger risk of playing into financial capital, and also in being able to create a politics that says that people 20 years later are to blame for their own poverty if they find themselves in difficult times. So I think it's more risky in that sense. But I agree with Troy. Like these things are won by movements. But I also don't think there's any real reason to believe that having a basic income in place makes Medicare or public education more at risk than without a basic income on the table. Like I don't think that politics quite works in that direct trade-off way. The countries that have more expansive welfare states tax people more in an ongoing, sustainably larger state way. There isn't a direct fiscal trade-off. I think that's partly what COVID has proven. And if you win an expansion of egalitarian social policy, then the movements that win that are more likely to effectively defend the other parts of the welfare state. I think that's what's more likely to happen. And the more people who receive these payments, the more powerful that constituency, and the harder to take it off them and the harder to stigmatise them. Yeah, so I think the more people we can get onto New Start, the better New Start will be.
Thank you for that. I'll just throw now to Mitchell Shakespeare, who's got a question relating to the Finland experiment. Can you go ahead, Mitchell?
Hi, Ben. Thanks for speaking to us today, and Troy, if you're there. My question was about, I came across an article from a couple of years ago talking about the Finnish trial, and it was a left-wing criticism of UBI, and it said that the trial makes explicit that its primary goal is being to promote employment by incentivizing people to accept low-paying and low-productivity jobs, as they'll be receiving the UBI as a form of income anyway. And so my question then is, what are your thoughts on that? Because it seems that one of the big kind of positive aspects of UBI pushed by its supporters is that it will give workers the ability to choose and the freedom to choose what jobs they do and don't want to do, whereas this trial seems to kind of be turning that on its head to a certain extent.
Yeah, thanks for your astute question as usual, Mitchell. The Finnish trial was flawed from the start for those reasons that you talk about. It's introduced by a centre-right coalition government for a start. Only one of the three coalition parties supports the trial. The other two more right-wing parties don't support the trial. The focus is completely, it gets reduced, and this has happened quite a number of times in the history of basic income, that you start off with this sort of broad, sort of sociological brief to have qualitative research done alongside the labour supply stuff. And then it gets boiled down to, will they work more? Will they work less? Yeah. And also that's an unnecessarily narrow way of doing things. Trials, again, we're never going to replicate a sort of real world scheme. They can be useful in some ways, I think mostly political, to be honest, but in other cases you're not getting a representative sample of the population. It was just long-term unemployed people. So you had 2,000 people who were the experimental group, and then another 173,000 people, which was the rest of the unemployed population, which was the control group. And these are the two groups you're looking at. And all that happened at the end of, and the other thing is time, right? The whole point about, not the whole point, but a big thing about the basic income is that it would be a permanent reform, right? Something you can rely on for life, not something that you get for 2 years. So these people go into it knowing that they've only got 2 years to be on this thing. And it wasn't particularly generous in terms of the level of the payment. There was a tiny positive labour supply response in the first year of the trial, and then basically nothing in the second year of the trial. And then I should add, having just slammed it for not looking at things other than labour supply response, they did look at some other well-being, self-reported well-being. And the people who got the basic income had higher self-reported well-being, but not a huge amount, but consistently over the 2 years of the trial than those people who were in the control group.
No, I think maybe just to say that I think that's significant in that this was set up as a kind of right-wing trial about labour supply. And it still did show that people were happier, felt better, were more optimistic, had better relationships as a result of being on it. And I think that is part, and Finland's system is nowhere near as punitive as our one is. So, you know, if you think about the control group in Finland, they are not going through the Inju card, they're not going through work for the dole, they're not going through robo-debt. And I think we sometimes, you know, we were just talking about distributional effects, but I think we really underplay how demoralizing our current system is. And even if the amount of money wasn't increased, just getting rid of that would really change people's lives.
Thanks for the question, Mitchell. I've got a question from Tim Diamond. What do you think the worst arguments are for a UBI? For example, the Silicon Valley tech billionaire argument that we need people to buy stuff even after the robots make everybody unemployed. And this is, I think Ben was definitely there when there was a Fabian's event about this, and I raised Yanis Varoufakis's quite strong point, I think, which is about reinflating demand in a very low demand, aggregate demand international economy. So, you know, while I probably agree with Tim's assessment that robots won't make everybody unemployed, I'm quite sympathetic to the Varoufakis view that we do need something to reinflate aggregate demand because of the effect of rentier capitalism, you know, pulling aggregate demand out of both labour and industrial capital. So maybe first question is, what do you think are the worst arguments for UBI from Tim? And what do you think about the robots will take all the jobs argument? But also, what do you think about the argument from Varoufakis that UBI would help reinflate aggregate demand?
You want to go, Ben?
Why don't you do the worst arguments, because you know them better than I do.
The worst arguments for a basic income. Yeah, I mean, I'd cite that one, the robots, jobs, apocalypse thing. And Ben can talk about that maybe in some more detail. But yeah, I don't think it's a good one to center your attention on. You know, to have your whole campaign for BI built around the robot jobs apocalypse that's just around the corner that you can't see and may never encounter. Other worst, it's a good question. It's not often asked at BI forums. A lot of time you get some, you know, what are the problems with basic income? This, that, and the other, blah, blah, blah. And why would basic income cause inflation? What would happen with economic growth? But this one made me think, and you know, the worst argument for basic income, in my view, are those put forward by some of the libertarians and those on the right who do put forward basic income as a replacement for the welfare state, or as Phelps did, as a wages subsidy directly. And again, it's not a conspiratorial thing. It's actually the argument that they are making in their own papers. So I think those are bad examples. I'm not sure there's, and some of my close friends in the basic income movement, if we want to get a bit hippie for a second, would probably disagree with me, but I'm not sure basic income will have much of an effect one way or the other on, say, climate change, or, like environmental outcomes. So that's one argument that's put forward on occasion. Have you got some stuff to go with, Ben?
Oh yeah. So I think Marie was dead on with Troy about that basic income is much more efficient than a proper welfare state. Those kind of efficiency arguments, while they're true of the worst bits of like work for the dole and the cashless debit card, which is stupidly expensive per person, are not generally true of the welfare state as a whole. That is that the administrative costs in aggregate aren't that high. And the costs of privatising all those things are much, much higher. So to give people enough money to actually buy privatised healthcare and privatised education would cost an absolute fortune, because those things are very inefficient. In terms of reflating the economy, I mean, I do think there are some bigger kind of transitional questions which are at the background here around what the purpose of an economy is at the point where we just had a period over the last 9 months where aggregate production fell considerably alongside poverty. Yeah. So we were better able to make sure everyone had as much as they needed, and we had a lot less stuff to distribute at the same time. So I think that just that insight shows you that aggregate production isn't a problem anymore in a country like Australia. It's just not a problem. So we have poverty, we have inequality, we have homelessness. Those things are not a result of a constraint on production. They just aren't. So is it really the main thing that we need to do as the left to solve the problem of underproduction? Or, I'm not sure it is. But having said that, I think it is true that something like basic income provides a state with a quite useful macroeconomic tool, which is actually why Treasury got a Conservative government that was deeply opposed to it to introduce things that look like it during the middle of the pandemic. And why family payments, which we were saying is the thing that looks most like this, was the main tool used by the Rudd government during the GFC, because you need to be able to get money to lots of people quickly, and you need to be able to do it in a kind of scaled way. And a basic income kind of gives you that tool to be able to mass inject lots of money to lots of people very quickly, to do that targeting low and middle income households rather than only the very poorest, while still being reasonably efficient and not going to very rich people. So I think it creates a tool that we're going to probably see more mainstream economists advocate for. It now is, things like the basic income actually are a template that's being rolled out across the global south, where there aren't advanced welfare states and where you don't have a tradition of a large-scale industrial workforce, which many of our policies are crafted around, kind of idealized worker. When you've got large informal economies and lots of people who aren't workers in a traditional capitalist sense, basic income can make a lot more, be much more practical. And that's kind of what's been happening in South Africa and Brazil and elsewhere. So I do think that there are strong kind of capitalist management arguments for a basic income, that it actually is a semi-useful tool for that. But I think one of the questions we should be asking ourselves as well is, what do we think about that now? Given that aggregate production, as I say, just I don't think there's any real argument that that's a problem for us, at least in the global north.
Thank you. So I'm just operating a progressive speaking list. So I've got a couple of questions there from blokes, and I am conscious that we've made this 3 blokes. I hope people can forgive us. We did have 3. We'll try and rectify that. I think our overall track record has been good. But there were 3 blokes who wrote this paper, and unfortunately I'm a bloke too, so sorry about that. But our next question is from Loriana Luciani. A question for Troy in regard to the social forces, the grassroots bottom-up movement that is needed to bring about any radical change. What is your analysis on current grassroots activism in Australia? It's present in terms of advertising and debating the concept, but not much consistent and organised. What is needed? How can it be brought about, at least theoretically? What support does it need? What constituents would it reach? She says, we do not discuss enough this within academia. But as you correctly pointed out, it is essential. Thank you. I think we can hear from you both about that. You're both thinkers.
Cheers, Luke, and thanks, Laureana. Nice to hear from you again. And I recommend to people, Laureana's got a good chapter on activism around basic income in Australia in a Power Grade book that was out this year. Look, it's maybe it's the most important question. And it's something that anyone who is interested in whatever moderately progressive or maybe a bit more radical changes going, right, well, how do we get there? How do we organise? And most of us would just go, well, we just have to do the organising that we did before, that we've somehow lost the capacity to do over the last 30, 40 years. And to some extent, there is no magical answer to this question, right? Or we would already have things like really obvious things like universal dental care would be part of Medicare, which, anyone with half a brain would say is an obviously good policy. Or that universal childcare that we enjoyed briefly in Australia there would have been a mass campaign that jumped up to support that and prevented ScoMo and Co from getting rid of it. Because to me, I would put that policy ahead of basic income, universal public childcare in Australia. And that's completely affordable. Building this, I think you'd have a chance to build an interesting type of coalition, Laureana, I think, with basic income potentially has great appeal to women, possibly cutting across class barriers, but even more so to lower income women or lower middle income women working part-time, to sort of simplify their access to both income and the labour market. And that's not enough to solve the sexual division of labour, but I'm saying this is potentially huge constituency there. Someone mentioned in another forum I was doing the other week on basic income that people with disabilities, who make up a very considerable share of the Australian population, could deal with sort of no nonsense, reduce the bureaucracy, access to a regular flow of income. Industrial labour or organised labour workers traditionally showed very little interest in basic income, even though opinion polling now in Europe and the US will show you that it is the traditional constituency of social democratic parties that are more likely to support basic income. But it is only very recently that we've seen a few trade unions get behind basic income, and particularly in Australia, we saw the United Workers Union, and I've seen Don Sutherland put up the link to the Life Campaign, which is an umbrella group of organisations that includes basic income among its claims for social reform. So I think it's thinking about the types of coalitions who might be open for farmers. I also think farmers, people living in regional areas where work is seasonal, fluctuates a lot, where climate change is biting hard. There's some potential for a very interesting, but maybe not an automatically natural coalition to be built around the idea of basic income, income security, and Australian basic income, as Ben has been calling it, I think, quite aptly in terms of our own model. And yes, looking to, of course, we're going to use some of the same methods that we would have used to win Medicare in the 1970s and 1980s, or maybe even similar campaign tactics that we used to around marriage equality campaigns over a long and controversial period of time. But yeah, it's going to be a combination of not reinventing the wheel, but also bringing a greater variety of groups into coalition around this policy. It's a long and maybe not totally satisfactory answer to a difficult question.
Is a question. Did you add something there, Ben?
I might just say it's very rare in Australian history or anywhere else, but where you get a large economic reform, so something that requires serious fiscal resources that is won by the left that isn't strongly backed by the union movement. And I think that's a big structural constraint that any campaign really does need to see the union movement being actively supportive of it, even if it's not the only component of the coalition. It's hard to imagine how it wins otherwise. But I do think there's an increasing constituency of people who are brutalised by the welfare system, like of going through Centrelink, and who, you know, it's not just the people who get it at any one point of time. This is over a period of time of people who have lost jobs or are between jobs, who have a little bit of part-time work, who have casual shifts where the money comes through some weeks and not others, and then they suddenly have to repay an amount of money because, you know, of the way Centrelink counts when they get money. I think a constituency around that, there are lots and lots of people, and those are really big issues that I think people would change their vote on. And I think one of the advantages of basic income is potentially providing a language around what that is that connects to a basic right and social need, rather than sounding like it's a very technical debate about the rules for accessing welfare. I think in practice, actually, most of the changes would be pretty technical changes to accessing welfare, but I think they need to be framed in a rights framework to mobilise a movement. But I do think that also needs to be able to align with the union movement. That started to happen, as Troy said, so there might be a shift going on that makes this more possible.
Just to pick up on something you mentioned there earlier, Troy, about the organised labour, and we had a question from Don Sutherland. You also mentioned the Life campaign. I've put the links to that. Don does correct me that basic income is not included in the statement of demands for the Life campaign, but it certainly does include demands for increases in social security provision. But Don asks, how does this proposal interact with award rates and relativities as they are now, and award making now and into the future?
Do you want to have a go at that one, Ben?
I'm happy to have a go with that. So, I mean, I think it's a really good question, right? So one of the big criticisms of basic income is that it is possible, and there's some evidence that basic income can act as a wage subsidy, which, depending on how the industrial system is set up and the bargaining power of labour, could lead to lower wage outcomes, because it's seen that this is given instead of wage outcomes, yeah? So I think the first thing to say is that this basic incomes are completely decoupled from work. And to a large extent, I think that should mitigate some of the way it interacts with the wage system. So it's not a wage subsidy in the sense that it goes to a whole bunch of people who have nothing to do with work, aren't looking for work, as well as to people who are engaged in paid work. So I think it really goes to, what do you think is going to happen to the bargaining power of labour? I think that's the key question. And look, there's an argument that Eric Ollenwright made, which is that this acts as a permanent strike fund, that it makes it easier for labour to take organised action. Look, I tend to think the rates we're talking about, which even a generous payment probably is 20 grand a year, is unlikely to help a worker on 70 grand a year go on strike for that long. But I think what it probably does do is create some kind of credible exit option for people at the bottom of the labour market. That is, for dirty and dangerous jobs, particular kinds of jobs we're thinking about in like Uber and Deliveroo, where they're not even like stable full-time incomes at the minimum wage, right? They're almost piecework, really. That at that level, you could imagine that having some stable income that was just enough to live on would allow people to say no to really, really bad job offers, and that would create some degree of additional bargaining power. I think that is likely, and I think you probably would see a slightly stronger bargaining power at the very bottom of the labour market. I'm less convinced it's going to do all that much for people in the middle of the labour market. And I agree that if it was done in not the right, in bad circumstances, there's even the potential for a conservative industrial commission to use it as a justification for holding down real wage rises.
Add something there too, Troy?
Oh, I think Ben was pretty thorough there. I just make the one point that a lot of the literature gets to, well, it would destroy the wage bargaining system, or on the other side, it would be a strike fund, right? And Ben nicely, explained these different positions, and that's part of Don's question as well. I think the real key point is that, coming back to what Ben said earlier, is that the unions would have to play, or organised labour, workers more broadly even than the union movement, would have to play a very key role in winning this right in the first place. It's an enormous, what effect it then has on, I don't know, different segments of the labour force, in terms of their power vis-a-vis the employer. Actually winning basic income in the first place, if it is a progressive basic income, would be a process of demonstrating the power of labour.
Man who knows a fair bit about the process of demonstrating the power of labour is Frank Stillwell. Very privileged to have him on the Zoom, as always. Good to see you, Frank. And he's got a question about universal basic services.
I just follow Troy wherever he goes. So,
I'm in Perth, Frank.
As always. Look, I mean, this is a pretty general question, picking up on some earlier themes. Universal basic services is an obvious goal for people on the left to pursue. Historically, the welfare state, but in the current context, public and social housing has to be right up there at the top of the list, along with public education, public childcare, public transport, public health. I mean, they're the big five in my mind, and particularly housing, because it's such a source of social stress and poverty. If we can only get that up, then presumably basic income could be quite modest. I mean, that all is primarily putting food on the table, but the public services can give you the underpinnings of a good life. Now, isn't that perhaps the better model to pursue? And if I can complicate the story further, basic services plus job guarantee, then as a third sort of element, the ultimate social safety net of basic income. Is that a more viable, more attractive, more feasible, more attractive strategy?
Well, thanks for that question, Frank. It's nice to see you again after so long. I would say that, we need, for those interested in progressive reform that is more than just the most marginal of tinkering, that there needs to be a sort of menu of policy demands, some of which are a bit unreasonable. And I would put basic income into that category. Even if Ben and I can show that it's technically entirely affordable, and ScoMo and Frydenberg back us up, it is also obviously true that the universal childcare, getting public dental care, boosting the public service is cheaper and possibly should be prioritised as a goal ahead of basic income. The job guarantee, I'm not an opponent of job guarantee. Like this is a to me, it's almost like a dull Twitter and Reddit debate about whether you're for the job guarantee or basic income. I don't have a problem in supporting both. I'm not necessarily sold on the idea that a job guarantee should be prioritised over basic income. I think the housing issue is critical. I know Ben, obviously Frank's an expert on housing. Ben's written a lot more and knows a lot more about housing than myself. I think an issue with housing, unlike say something like childcare, is childcare we can make universal pretty much overnight. The housing option, the perennial problem is the time it takes to solve this issue of inadequate provision of social or affordable housing. Might throw to Ben on that.
Make sure he's unmuted, because sorry, Ben. There we go.
Thanks. Sorry, my dogs are barking, so I was trying to save everyone from that. Yeah, look, I think that one of the advantages actually of a basic income is that I think it makes universal services, like if you imagine that it actually happened, in some ways it makes them more fiscally rational, right? So we have an example with Medicare and the wage labour bargain, that Medicare was partly justified on the basis that there could be a trade-off with money wages. I think that you would see the cost of directly providing services for free and reducing the universal payment in proportion would probably leave everyone net better off, because these things are public goods, and possibly would allow the government to expand services more quickly if there was a mechanism to be able to facilitate that trade-off. Not that I'm saying that that's all going to happen straight overnight. But yeah, obviously universal services is a great thing and we should be campaigning for it. I think the thing with housing, which is also interesting, is how marketized our understanding of even what universal social housing is, which is that everyone still pays for it, right? So we have a system at the moment where the government, you know, for everyone most of the people in social housing, their primary source of income is government payments. So literally what happens is the government gives people money so they can give another government the money back in order to provide a service. Which is partly why we're moving it from publicly owned to community owned, is to game that system so that different actors can access the flow of funds. And that, I think, shows just how challenging the housing question is. No one is suggesting that we do with housing what I think at least there is some, reasonable discussion that you could make childcare free. No one's suggesting we make housing free. And I think that demonstrates just how deeply embedded the marketisation is, and probably why some degree of universal income is genuinely needed. Precisely because we are not about to get to the point, even in the wildest dreams of most of the proponents of universal services, that people could live their life without an income, without a money income. And so I do think it is important that we challenge that pillar too, and say that access to income is a human right in a monetary economy, in addition to the services, which should also be universal rights and free wherever possible.
Can I just jump in there very quickly, Luke, with one final comment? I just think this is a particularly important point for lefties of whatever hue. You're a Greenie, you're a Social Democrat, you're a communist, you're a socialist, whatever. That often the political institutions, whether it's the trade unions or the think tanks around the political parties, or the political parties themselves, get tied in knots around the issue of tax. How are you going to finance these things? Whereas the right wing has just shown us quite clearly that, you can finance things really quickly. And you need to be, at the political level, open to the possibility of contingency, acting quickly in certain, contingent circumstances. Hawke did not introduce Medicare in propitious economic times in 1984. It was a commitment to the ACTU, and we won't get into all of that. But similarly, a lot of the economic / social policies that Whitlam introduced in that brief 3-year period was a period of utter economic, chaos. But fortunately, as Goff said, he didn't know much about economics, and it helped him to ignore economists and to just implement things. So that's what I'd like to leave on.
That is a particularly good one to leave on, but I will let Ben have a final word because we are right up on 7 o'clock. So any final thoughts, Ben, before we flick to our song? I've put him on mute again, haven't I? Sorry, Ben. Yep. 1 second. There you go.
No, I put me on mute. Sorry, it's a fault of habit. But no, that's all good. Thank you very much. That was a fantastic discussion. So just a big thank you to the Search Foundation and to everyone who came along.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Troy Henderson, Ben Spies-Butcher. It's been brilliant. As always, these things go incredibly quickly. It's all like in a flash. As I often say, you guys are, our guests tonight are not in the ivory tower. If there was a question that we didn't get to, it is on Twitter. I don't know. I'm not sure if Troy is on Twitter, but if you,
I am. I've sledged you about the Roosters several times.
That's right. I knew you were. Just couldn't find your handle. Anyway, if you'd like to post you can find these guys on Twitter. You can probably send me an email and I can forward it on to them if you don't use Twitter or anything else. But other than, they're also both public intellectuals. So if you have a particular bugbear that you want to raise with them, there we go. That's Troy C. Henderson. A question that you want to put, you want to invite them to another further meeting, something like that. They are eminently available for further discussion. Thank you all so much for coming along tonight here well into December. I'll now, you can, as you can see, you can write anything that you like in the chat section, any comments, any links, any campaign things. This is the last big search public event for the year, so I want to thank everyone for coming along to so many of ours throughout this year. I think it's been a great one to finish on. And I will now